Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to go backward a little bit because I want to give you a little bit of history and foundation before we charge ahead with the talking about philosophy and literature. One of the things I want to do today is give you a little bit of a history of literature. This is going to be primarily British and American literature, mainly because these are the literatures that I'm the most familiar with. We will talk about other literatures, other philosophies, though it won't just be that, but most literatures have seemed to move, at least Western literatures, in a similar way to what the British and American have. In the beginnings of British literature, because you got to start there before American literature, because you don't have American literature in English until much later. You do start with the oral tradition period, and the early literature in Britain was in Old English. It was in basically a form of German. So if you were to listen to it or read it, unless you spoke Dutch or German, you probably wouldn't get much out of it. But these works have been largely translated. Beowulf, The Wanderer, The Seafarer, these are all uh, works that were originally in Old English that were translated by Christian monks into uh, Middle English first and then eventually into modern English. Now, the um, early traditions, as I said, were oral and they were all poetry. The origins of all literature, as we've talked about, is poetry. And why is this? Well, it's much easier to remember a poem than it is to remember the chapter of a novel. And in fact, novels don't really make their way into the mainstream until much later. Um, as you move into the after the Norman conquest, you have the French conquer England, and so the English literature takes on a lot of the French characteristics, takes on a lot of the French stories, and in fact, the earliest Arthurian legends are in French, not in English, and so we move into the Arthurian tales and things like that, and the audience in Old English would be for warriors. It would be people in the beer hall. It would be listening. And the point of the literature was to educate them, as we talked about in the last couple episodes. It would be to teach them, ethics. It would be to teach them how to be a good visitor, how to be a good host, how to be a good warrior. These were all things that were conveyed with literature. And these were predominantly for a male audience because there were very few women that would have been the audience for literature in the Old English period. Now, if you go back enough into the period where it was more tribal, I'm sure that would be a lot different, but none of that literature really survived. You don't really start to get the idea of thinking about a female audience until the Middle English period, after the Norman conquest of 1066. And that's the influence of the French. The audience moves from the beer hall into the court, and in the court, you have both men and women. So you get a lot of these stories that are, have more female characters and are also geared towards educating men on how to behave. This is where you start to see the code of chivalry, how a knight should act towards a lady. Now, this was really not as enlightened as it seems because this was only upper class ladies. The lower classes, the peasantry, there are lots of stories of the knights just having a good time and having their way with these women. But there was the idea that the knight, when it came to uh, upper class women, should be more respectful. And so, why would this be good for a female audience as well? For one, it's a way of civilizing the soldiers because one of the things that happens frequently in warfare is, unfortunately, a large amount of raping and pillaging. These stories of trying to civilize these warriors, these knights, was to kind of tell them when you take over another kingdom that you should become the protector of these women. And so there does tend to be a desire to establish a code of conduct in these stories. Now, as time goes on, you start to get uh, the decline of the church for a few reasons. One, you have the Black Plague, and that starts to decimate Europe. And the church doesn't seem to be able to offer any answers of why, um, especially since during the Black Plague, you know, the poor and the rich seem to be dying in the same numbers, the good and the bad. So people started wanting a different reason for this. And about this same time, you get an influx of literature from people who had taken the Greek and the Roman classics and fled to the Middle East when Rome became Christianized. Those works largely disappeared out of the West and they went to the Middle East, and they were kept by Middle Eastern scholars. Well, about the time of the plague, you start to have the Middle Eastern Islamic nations becoming less receptive to foreign literatures. And so, in order to save their skins, a lot of these scholars fled back to Europe. And so, it was perfect timing for this literature to be reintroduced. And so, you start to get into what is known as the classical period in literatures, where you have not only a lot of the Greek and Roman stories and myths coming back, but you also have a lot of their styles coming back. You know, the blank verse. The blank verse is basically, you know, 10 syllables and the rhyme at the end. Rhyming couplets. These are the heroic verse. These are all things that came out of the Greeks and the Romans. And so you start to see a lot more of that. You also see a lot more of the opening up of philosophy. You know, in earlier periods before the Black Plague, most philosophy was basically Christian. It was talking about elements in Christian theology. With people looking in different ways, you start to get a rebirth also of secular philosophy. So you start to get lots of different cultural influences, lots of different philosophical ideas coming about. This leads into what's known as the Renaissance. And in British literature and British language, this is when we really move into the modern English period, where English becomes codified. It has a one grammar that everyone uses. It has, one alphabet that everyone writing in English is using. Prior to modern English, during the Middle English period, there were some people that were still using some of the Old English symbols, the thorn, the eth, and the yod, depending on where you lived, were still being used. Now, the thorn was generally used as a hard th with words like the and that and thy. The eth was generally a breathy th, more what you would hear with bath or with. You hear that more air with that one. And then the yod was a y at the beginning of a word, and if it appeared in the middle at the end of the word, it was generally a gh sound. The Middle English time period, you also had no silent letters. Everything was pronounced during Middle English. You move into Modern English, we have pronunciation similar to what we have today. Words like night, Knight, and Night both become pronounced the same in Modern English. You drop that sounding out every letter. Middle English, they would have been pronounced kinikta and nikta. Modern English, we move into night and night. So we start to get a lot of the modernization of sounds as well. Shakespeare, believe it or not, is actually part of the Renaissance and part of modern English because he's using standardized spelling, the same alphabet, and the silent letters. He's actually in the modern period. Now, the language that he used was generally what's known as poetic diction. So this is an elevated style of speaking and writing. If you were to go back to the time period of Shakespeare, people wouldn't be speaking exactly the same way they were in his plays and in his poetry, because that was a literary language. It was archaic even at that time. So the language would have been very different as you know what you spoke every day and what you heard when you went to the theater. As we move through the Renaissance, English literature goes into the neoclassical period, still picking up a lot of the ideas and styles of the Greeks and Romans, but it's starting to apply more British themes, more English themes. So it's kind of shifted into trying to find uh, kind of a language and a storylines of its own. Although it's still a period of borrowing heavily from these. When you out of start moving out of the neoclassical period, and by the way, most literature all the way through the neoclassical period is poetry for the most part. Even essays and long stories are still generally written in poetic form. One of the things that starts to happen as you're moving out of the neoclassical period is that you start to have another shift in who is the audience for literature. You start to have a rise of the middle class. You start to get people who are merchants and business people who are actually becoming wealthier than the aristocracy. The aristocracy had all of their wealth based on land, and their wealth was tied to land. The rising middle class, their wealth is tied to other things. It's not bloodlines. It's trading. It's selling and buying. And so, as this new audience comes along, you get this shift to a more middle class audience. During the earlier periods, the neoclassical, the classical, you know, your audience, even though they eventually shifted to male and female, they still mainly only had the upper classes in mind. Whenever you had a lower class character, it was generally for comedy. If you look at Shakespeare's um, dramas, when you look at there's a funny part in it, when there's funny characters in it, those characters are more lower class people. They weren't considered really the audience, and so they weren't taken into consideration as much in the literatures. As you move out of the neoclassical, you start to move into what's known as the Romantic period. And with the shift in audience, you start to get a couple of changes. One, you get more lower and middle class characters being the hero of the story, being the center of the story. So stories are not just about kings and queens and knights and gods and goddesses. It starts to be about, regular everyday people. As you get into this new audience, this is also when you start to get the rise of a new form of literature. It's not really completely new, but it's new in that it wasn't produced very much. And this new form of literature is prose. The middle classes and the lower classes that can read tend to want things more in prose. So this is when you get the rise of the novel in British literature. You start to get lots of novels written. Prior to the Romantic period, you still had novels written, but you only had maybe two or three a century. Now they're starting to be produced a lot. The Romantic period was also a philosophical period, like the Renaissance, where it rejected the authority of the church. The Romantic period starts to reject the Enlightenment a little bit, because a lot of what drove the neoclassical after the Romanticism, or I'm sorry, after classicism, was this rise in science, this rise in thinking we can figure out the world mathematically, scientifically. You start to get a lot of fear by that during the Romantic period. People see this rise as something that is decentering human beings. It's making us just part of this uh, cog in the wheel of the machine of the universe. And so you start to have people that are pushing back against that and saying, no, the important things aren't just science and math. It's also, the important things are creativity and, you know, uh, having a one-on-one connection to the world. This is where, in the Romantic period, in England, it starts a little earlier. It also starts in Italy and France and Germany. All of them, are moving into the Romantic period as well. The United States moves in a little later because we're not really in the heart of Europe. So ideas back then tended to we were out on the frontiers, so the ideas tended to come to this country much later. Romantics in the American tradition were inspired not only by the British Romantics, but also by people like the Transcendentalists, who we'll go into in quite a bit of detail in future episodes. People like Emerson and Thoreau, people that were looking to have a uh, individual connection to nature, something and to God, not something that is passed down through holy texts and not something that is just passed down through science and math. It's you get the idea of the individual being able to have this personal one-on-one relationship, and so this is driving a lot of what becomes the Romantic movement in the United States. The biggest Romantic writers in the United States, um, people like Walt Whitman, people like Edgar Allan Poe. These are some of the names that everyone knows. The British, part of their uh, when as they're moving through the Romantic period, they start to see some of the problems with this more individualistic um, philosophy, this more individualistic worldview. Part of it is when Napoleon comes along, a lot of the Romantic writers think, this is a good thing, and then they start to see how destructive this can become. Also, a lot of the British Romantics are basically two generations. You have the older Romantics, people like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Southey, and if you don't know all these names, you can, do a quick search on them and find out who they are. But this is the first generation of Romantics. The second generation that comes along are people like Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, John Clare, Mary Shelley, Keats. These are people who have much more excessive lifestyles, and because of that, most of the younger Romantics are dead before the older Romantics. Most of the younger Romantics, with the exception of a couple, Mary Shelley and a couple of the other minor writers, are generally dead before they're 30 or before they're 40. Byron's dead by 36. Shelley's dead by about 30. John Clare, although he lived, he went, completely insane before he was 30 and was kind of not really institutionalized, but living with his mother. Keats died young, about 26, from his wasn't because of excessiveness, though. Keats died because of tuberculosis. He caught it taking care of family members. So there's a real pushback against the Romantics in England. The pushback in America will come too, but it comes first in England. And what's going on in England is you have the rise of Queen Victoria also. And so you start to move away from the Romantics and into what's known as Victorian literature. And this is where England kind of goes a different path than the rest of Europe and America. Europe and America go a little bit different direction after Romanticism. The Victorian literature is very, prim and proper, kind of trying to get back to very moralistic, novels where people don't do things they're not supposed to. You don't have sex in Victorian literature. It's hinted at or alluded to, but it's never directly broached. It's something that kind of is pushed in the background. Oddly enough, the Victorian period in England, where everyone is reading these prim and proper novels, Jane Austen and things like that, um, it's also one of the biggest times of pornography in England. So while they have these prim and proper, mannerly novels sitting on their, coffee tables in their rooms where they're entertaining, hidden in their bedroom, they have very extreme pornography. And Victorian pornography is, um, in a lot of ways, it's even worse than things that are out today because there really were no rules about it. So it breaks every taboo you can imagine. So England kind of goes off into this prim and proper, but kind of split time in literature. There's the appropriate literature that's prim and proper, and then there's the hidden stuff that everyone's reading. The United States and the rest of Europe move into, as they move out of Romanticism, they move into what's known as realism. So the the catalyst for the United States for realism is the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War in the United States, unless you were a pioneer, most Americans never went more than 50 miles from where they were born. You were born, raised, got married, grew old, and died within a little 50-mile area of, that was your whole life. During the Civil War, you had farm boys from Maine being sent down into Mississippi and Alabama and Texas, and Georgia to fight. And so they're seeing very different ways that Americans live. Prior to the Civil War, most Americans thought, well, they probably live about like we do, with the exception of there were slave states and free states. The Civil War completely broke that. And after the Civil War, there became a desire for putting the country back together. And in this desire, people wanted to know, well, what do people in different parts of the country eat? How do they speak? What are their customs? And so, one of the things with realism is it wants to get an authentic sense of different areas. And in realism, this is where you get for the first time things being written in dialects. Now, prior to that, the Romantic periods and earlier, there was kind of a more or less standard language that most people wrote in. There was a literary language. It wasn't quite as high as it was in Shakespeare's time, but there was the idea that there was kind of this literary language that everyone would use. After the Civil War ends, there's a desire to put the country back together, and so you start to get writers writing a lot of pieces in dialect. Think about people like Mark Twain, and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain, if you read that novel, gives each of the characters different dialects that are authentic based on where they're from. The people in town don't speak the same way as the people in the country. As they move up the river, people don't speak the same way in the different parts of the South as they move up the river. Jim and Huck do not speak the same way. So there's this desire for realism. They want literature to be realistic. And in the United States, that's really, trying to say, well, how do we, put the country back together and get to know these other people that are also Americans? So with the realism period, you also start to get a little bit of pessimism creeping in. During the Romantic period, there was kind of an idea that nature was tied to us. So, if you were sad, it's raining outside. If you're happy, the sun is shining, the birds are singing. Think about Edgar Allan Poe's stories. The gloominess inside the character is reflected by the outside world and vice versa. They're intimately connected. During the realist period, people start to take a different view of nature. Nature is not connected to us, we're not one with it. It's more of a neutral thing. And if you think about this philosophically and in your own life, you could be having the best day of your life, but it's, dreary and gloomy and raining outside, but you just, had a great day. Or you could be having the worst day of your life and it's, a bright sunny day. So nature is more neutral seen as neutral um, during the realism period. Now, as this period goes on, there are certain things that start to push people's view of nature away from being neutral to it being more hostile. One of the things that changes a lot of people's perception, one of the first things is Darwin's Origin of Species. Now, the idea of evolution is not something that Darwin invented. Most people think Darwin invented the idea of evolution. Darwin is somebody who came up with the idea of natural selection, and also, did a lot more field research into evolution and kind of formalized it more. But you get ideas about evolution that go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, so and probably way before them. So this idea had been there. What Darwin does is that really changes things is that he writes Origin of Species, and this is a book that everybody reads. This isn't something that's just contained within scientists and intellectuals. Origin of Species was massively popular. It was hard to get your hands on a copy. Libraries would have huge waiting lists to get it. And so this is something that brings this idea to the common people. Now, with this idea coming to the common people, you get a shaking of the certainty that humans have. We're no longer the beings that all of this was created for. We're just one being among other beings. This is the first time you start to get a really cohesive explanation about where humans come from that doesn't involve either a god or gods and goddesses. This is the first time you start to get a cohesive view of where humans come from that is tied to natural processes. So this begins to shake people's foundations a little bit. Another thing that starts to shake people's foundations during the realism period is industrialism. Industrialism was bigger in Europe first, but it starts to catch on in the United States too. And, the Enlightenment idea behind technology is that it was going to free humans. It was going to make us, cut loose from the drudgery work of life. What it does is when you start getting factories, it does the exact opposite. People are working 12, 14, 16 hours a day at the pace of a machine. And this is also the first time that people start to use clocks. Clocks are used as a measure for productivity. You want to do so many of this in an hour, so many of this in a day. And so time begins to be measured more precisely. And this is something that is, there was timekeeping before that, but it's not something that most people ever knew about. It's not something that affected most people. Time for most people prior to the Industrial Revolution moved along natural time. You had, the seasons. You had, the hours of daylight and night. Sun's coming up. It's time to, get up, feed the animals, eat breakfast. It's sun's, halfway up the sky. It's time for lunch. Sun's going down. It's time for dinner. It's springtime. We should plant. It's fall. We should harvest. So the Industrial Revolution is the first time we're starting to measure everything by the ticking of a clock. You've got to be somewhere at a certain time. I don't think most people today realize how new of a concept this is for humans. We're very immersed in it in modern life. You got to be in this place, and then you have this long to be there, and then you got to be in this place, and then you got to be in this place, and it's all sectioned out for you your whole day and every day. This is relatively new for humans. This is something that doesn't really come along until the Industrial Revolution. So as these things are happening, people are seeing technology as something that is starting to enslave us. It's making our lives harder. They're seeing we've kind of been decentered as, the important species. People start to become more pessimistic about our view in nature. So one of the things that happens is realism starts to become more pessimistic, and you start to move into what's known as naturalism. In naturalism, the big shift that occurs is that nature is now hostile. And you start to see in these naturalist books that, nature is not our friend. In a romantic novel, you would have the character, go out into the wilderness and become enlightened and, be transformed. In naturalist novels, you have a person go out into the wilderness and die, or they leave the group and they die. Things like To Build a Fire by Jack London, where the main character is a rugged outdoorsman in Alaska. He's going to go off on his own into the Alaskan wilderness with his dog, and he's going to meet his, friends at the next camp. And he ends up, falling through the ice, getting wet, and, he's unable to build a fire, so he freezes to death. In stories like The Awakening with Kate Chopin, you get, the woman who decides to, leave her husband and children. And because she leaves her husband and children, she doesn't go off and live a life of freedom. She ends up, drowning in the ocean. She ends up dying. So there's this very strong undercurrent in naturalistic literature that if we don't stick together, we're going to die. That we have to work together in order to even survive. So it's still trying to do the same thing that realism did. It's just taking a different philosophical approach to what our position in nature is. It's no longer neutral, it's something that we have to overcome. And the only way we can do that is as a group. As you move into the beginning of the 20th century, things keep getting worse. Industrialization gets worse and worse. You start to get terrible conditions in the climate, because of pollution from factories and, burning coal and things like this. Rivers get polluted. But you also have a couple of major events that start happening in the 20th century that really make us question everything. And one of these events is World War One. Before World War One, for the majority, there was kind of this image painted that war was this glorious thing. You had these glorious soldiers going out into the field of battle and, achieving glory and victory. And even if they die, they're dying heroically. You did have a few writers who kind of questioned this earlier. One of them is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, but it doesn't really start to get questioned until World War One and after. And one of the things that changes in World War One is that you start to get a more mechanized warfare. The wars prior to World War One were mostly fought with, single shot weapons. You would have the troops line up in lines and, march a certain distance, take a shot, march a little farther, take another shot, and then they would charge in, and it would be mostly hand-to-hand combat. It was much more stylized and ritualized. When you get into World War One, you start to get things like the machine gun. You start to get things like trench warfare and poison gas and, planes that can drop small bombs. So it starts to be seen as technology as something far from being something good, is not only enslaving us, but it's finding clever ways to kill us off. And so there starts to be this growing pessimism. And one of the things that after the end of World War One that kind of kicks this into even higher gear is at the end of World War One, you have the Spanish influenza that wipes out tens of millions of people in the world. Now, all of us have just lived through, you know, the lockdowns and things of COVID. Um, it's a similar thing. So this is actually something that, prior to COVID, most modern people didn't really have a good sense of what it was like living through a plague. Now we do. And so this, in addition to the war, starts to really get us pessimistic about the way things are going. And we move into a style of writing in the United States and in Europe called modernism. And in modernism, people see that the old ways just aren't working anymore. They want them to. They want the world to make sense, but it doesn't seem to be making sense anymore. So in modernism, you have a an experimentation that starts to happen. People start trying to play with the narrative. They see themselves as living in a broken world. One of the poems that I think really illustrates this the best is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. If you read T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, it can be difficult to read, but if you keep in mind that he's talking about all of these fragments of the things we used to do and the things we used to believe, and how these things no longer seem to work. What Eliot is doing, though, is he wants to say if we could just put these broken pieces back together, perhaps we can make something that works. You see, modernist writers like Faulkner writing The Sound and the Fury, which we're going to be doing quite a few episodes on The Sound and the Fury. And As I Lay Dying, where you have, the timeline starts to be played with. This is something that you don't really see much before modernism. Usually in a story pre-modernism, it follows the old plot line. You have the initial incident, you have rising action, you have a climax in the action, and then the action falls off to the resolution. People started looking at the world and saying, this isn't the way life works. It doesn't work in a straight line. It's not a straight plot line. It moves back and forth, and you gain ground and you lose ground, and then you move in a completely different direction. So they start to play with the timeline in literature, especially prose literature. You have flashbacks and flash forwards. We're very familiar with this, now. Well, all of us have gone to a movie where the movie starts and, the main character is dying and everything's destroyed, and the person says, well, let me go back and tell you how I got here. And then they move back and forth. This is one of the things that starts to be experimented with in modernism. And again, it's because there's this desire, if we can just reconfigure all of these things, we can have a world that makes sense again. Go through the 20s into the 30s, and you have the Great Depression, that's going through there. So science and technology are going to kill us. Religion doesn't seem to be holding all the answers anymore. And now the economy's out to kill us too. The economic system we've been taught to believe in has almost completely collapsed, and you've got people starving. We move into even more pessimism as the 30s go along. You get into a catastrophe for the farmers as well. The farmers had been slightly insulated because people had to eat, but then in the early to mid 30s, you start to get the drought and the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl is much worse than I think most people realize. One of the things, is you have these dust storms that, one, there's no warning, they just come out of nowhere. And in April of 34, there was what was known as the Black Blizzard. It was a dust storm that basically went from, New Mexico area, Colorado area, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And, the first warning that a lot of people had that this was coming was they look up and see a big cloud of dust coming over. It buried houses to the roof. There are pictures of, if you look up the Black Blizzard, there are, cars that are buried, houses that are buried. A lot of people end up getting dust pneumonia and dying. If they didn't die during the storm, a lot of them died from complications afterwards. Uh, so, you get a sense now that nature is also trying to kill us. So now you add that to, all of our problems. We've got the depression, we've got the Dust Bowl, and then the late 30s come along, and we get some bad news coming out of Europe. And the bad news coming out of Europe is fascism and the Nazis. And then we start to move into World War II. Well, if people thought World War One was horrible with the invention of the machine gun, World War II really ramped things up, because now you have not only machine guns, but you have planes that can drop much larger bombs. You get warfare that is all over the planet for the most part. You get the Holocaust happening in Germany, and so it looks like we're really just on the verge of destroying ourselves. And then at the end of the war, we kind of get the ultimate wake up call that we're heading in the wrong direction when we drop the two atomic bombs on Japan. So now forget about, killing a couple of thousand people or a couple of hundred people with bombs. You can drop bombs that could now kill hundreds of thousands or millions with a single bomb. And we move into, the paranoia with the nuclear age, atomic warfare. When we come out of World War II, um, the rest of the world is pretty much destroyed. The United States, we didn't get destroyed as much because the war was not really fought here except for Pearl Harbor. So all of our factories are doing well, and they're still there. We still have roads, whereas the rest of Europe is just bombed into rubble. They have to be completely rebuilt. And we move into the 50s. And the 50s is still the modernist period, but the 50s takes on a very artificial sense. We kind of move away from reality in the 50s quite a bit. Why? Because people just came out of the Dust Bowl, the Depression, World War One, World War Two. The Russians have the bomb, we have the bomb, and they don't want to think about anything anymore. If you look at the television and movies and literature of the 50s, it often becomes very superficial. You have perfect families, one father, one wife, two children, the dog. There's no child abuse, there's no spouse abuse, there's no everybody's happy, there's no problems, and there's no way that that ever was reality. Much of what you see in the 50s is people trying to forget what the half of the century they had just lived through. And also, a lot of it is driven by a marketing campaign. Um, and this is one of the things that we'll talk about in narrative, how much, narratives actually shape people's view of the world. Prior to the 50s, most families in the United States lived in multi generational homes. You had the parents who would have children, and then as their children grew up, they would take over the house and have children of their own, one of the oldest or whatever, and then the parents would retire sort of to the back of the house and be the grandparents. And so you had multiple generations living together. Well, the problem with multi generational homes is you don't sell a lot of products. And they were looking for a way, advertisers were looking for a way, and economists, to stimulate the economy. If you just get the house from your parents, that house is fully furnished. You've already got furniture, you've already got drapes, you've already got pots and pans. You don't have to buy anything that much. Just replace the things that are, damaged or worn out. In the 50s, they're trying to stimulate the economy. So they say, oh, no, no, no. We've got the idea of the nuclear family. It's husband and wife and children. Parents have their own place, or the parents go live in a retirement home. And so you get this idea set up that, you got to buy a new house, have a new car. And if you, have ever moved into an apartment or a new house, what's in it? Absolutely nothing. It's walls and fixtures. You've got to buy furniture, you've got to buy pots and pans and plates and silverware, you've got to buy curtains, you've got to buy rugs, and all of these things, you have to buy appliances. All of these things you know, are pushed so that, it stimulates the economy. Um, as we move through the 50s, things, even though people are trying to pretend everything is wonderful, it's not really wonderful. There is child abuse, there is spouse abuse, there is segregation. Racism is terrible. If people, have the people who have the idea that the 50s were so perfect, well, if the 50s were so perfect and everyone was so happy, why did the 60s happen? And the answer is it wasn't perfect. That was an image by Hollywood and Madison Avenue that was basically people were sold a bill of goods that, we're all living the perfect life. Because if we really were, there wouldn't be all the turmoil of the 60s. The women didn't have very many rights. Different, all the different minority groups didn't have any rights. Blacks didn't have any rights. There was still segregation. There were signs that you would go in, places up through the 50s that would say, Irish not allowed. Irish need not apply. So it was um, a very dark time in history that was kind of fluffed up and made to look happy. There were a lot of people that were left behind. And this is where we start to move into the turmoil of the 60s. People start to see this life as being not very realistic and not very happy. And so people start to question some of these values that they've been sold. And so you start to get what I guess you could consider the beginnings of culture wars, where people are, having countercultures that are saying, no, we don't like the mainstream. We want to go a different direction. You get the hippie counterculture movement. Now, even this was predated by other people. There were people going all the way back into the 20s and 30s that were thinking similar things. But it was a very small subsection of the country. It wasn't the mainstream. You had people in the 20s and 30s that were hobos. And for those that don't know what hobos are people who basically looked at modern life and said, no, thank you. And they basically were voluntarily homeless. They would travel from place to place. They'd work when they had to. They had no interest in being tied into a house and a marriage and children and, all of these things that Madison Avenue said we had to be, had to have to be whole people. The 60s counterculture movement is the first time these ideas start to hit a much wider audience. And we move into a newer period and the next period in literature. We move out of the modernist period in the 60s and into what's known as the postmodernist. And we talked about the philosophy behind the modernists, in that if we just take these pieces and somehow put them together in the right way, we can make sense of everything again. Starting in the 60s, people start to realize, no, you can't. That reality is too complicated to have all of the pieces fit together and everything works out. So postmodern literature is kind of based on the philosophy that reality is too complex to ever grasp at all. And you start to get stories where all of the parts do not make sense together. If you've ever read a book or watched a movie where you get to the end of the movie and you're like, I don't really understand what that was. Was that a happy ending? Is it over? Is it going to be a part two? Because it seems like everything is just unresolved. And this is a lot of the philosophy behind postmodern literature. Postmodern literature undergoes, some splits. We get a rise in a lot of feminist literature. We get a rise in, post-colonial literature comes along, where we're kind of questioning the ideas of, Western ideals are just that. They're Western ideals. They're not something that should be enforced on everyone. Prior to that, there was sort of this, I guess you'd just call it a bigotry, that people in the West did everything better and it was okay if we made everyone do it our way. In post-colonial, we start to have writers that are coming out of these colonies that are saying, no, basically you took away everything good about our culture and you turned it into kind of a hellish slavery culture. And so we are kind of in a period in literature right now where there's a lot of different uh, points of view and a lot of different directions, and people don't look at literature anymore as, well, I should just study, you know, this tradition or that tradition. Literature has moved much more towards the idea of studying world literature, which is really the way it always should have been, anyways. If you look at the great literary writers throughout history, they didn't just read the people in their own tradition. They were always looking to other traditions, whatever they could get their hands on, and kind of trying to see, well, what are the good ideas they have, as opposed to the ideas, what are their bad ideas, what are our bad ideas, what are, and they were trying to move in new directions. And I think as a mainstream, we've tended to move more in that direction. The literary writers were already there. The mainstream society has started to move that way as well. Now, this doesn't mean you don't get reactionary people. You'll get people who will say, "No, I want to go back to the good old days. We need to do things the way they did because back then everything was perfect." And as someone who has studied a lot of history, I can tell you there's no such thing as the good old days. There is not a time period you can point to that I would rather live in. Every time period that looks wonderful in the past looks wonderful because the people who were in charge were the ones that had the voices that got heard. Those were the ones that told the stories we still have. If you actually look back into those periods and how people lived at day-to-day life, none of those time periods were very good. You think, oh, the 50s were great. Yeah, they were great. We had this idea that any moment the Russians were going to blow up the world, or we were going to. And again, we were trying to forget World War One, World War Two, the Holocaust, the Dust Bowl, and the Depression. So it was a time of living in denial. People my age, I'm Gen X, tend to look at the 80s and think, oh, the 80s were a wonderful time. It was perfect. No, it wasn't perfect. We were still in the Cold War. The good jobs were starting to disappear. Deregulation was starting to happen. People were starting to lose, the ability to work at the same company for 30 years and retire. And if you look, and AIDS was also a big thing in the 80s. People didn't know where it came from really. They had suspicions. Could you get AIDS from hugging somebody? Could you get it from a drinking fountain? Um, and so if you really look back at every time in history, the idea that we can go back to the good old days is ridiculous because there was no good old days. Every time period has its benefits and its challenges. And so, as we go through and talk about the different things in literature and philosophy, I do want to keep bringing it to bringing out history, bringing out everyday issues. When I got my degrees in literature and philosophy, I didn't get them because I thought, oh, this is a way to escape reality. These are ways of examining more thoroughly reality and looking at, well, what kinds of things have we been taught that is the this is the way it is. But when you look at it, you're like, no, this is just what we've been handed and said, here, believe this, here, run with this. Some of the ideas hold up against reality, some of them don't. And so I will always try in these episodes, when we're talking about something, to not only be talking about the philosophical or the literary issue, but bringing it out to the wider world. Okay, this is a very long episode in comparison to my other ones. I generally will try to keep my episodes between 30 minutes and an hour. But I'm going to cut off this one for right now. I hope all of you are doing well. I hope all of you are staying safe, and I will talk to you again soon.